So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar of ESWET related to the BREF, Waste Incineration BREF, 1 year later. That's a big question, what happened in the last year. And I'm very happy to welcome you with my guest, which is Anita Matic from the Commission, Lighea Speziale from CEWEP, who's advisor to CEWEP, and Bettina Kamuk, who's working for Ramboll. We will have today the 3 presentations and after this a Q&A. But before this, I will make a short introduction. So my name is Clerens. I'm Secretary General of ESWET, the European Association representing the suppliers of waste to energy technologies. So my members are the ones who are building the plants, who are making the flue gas cleaning, and who make sure that all this residual waste is destroyed in a safe and efficient circular way. I am therefore moderating this discussion on the BREF, the best available technology reference documents, which is a document needed which is a document which will set the guidelines for the permits which you need to exploit a plant. Within 4 years from the date of publication of the BREF, which was in December 2020, you will have to, no, 2019, it was, sorry, December 2019, I mixed up 1 year. You will have to implement the requirements of the BREF for all existing plants. And therefore, we are wanting to check how far are we now, what happened in the last year from end of 2019 to end of 2020, and to see what it will be and what will come for the future. So, therefore, we have these presentations, and they will be very interesting. You will see they're very complementary. Anita will give the point of view from the Commission, Lighea a bit the European point of view, and Bettina will talk about the global point of view. And the different skills will allow afterwards for a panel discussion, which will reply to your questions. So please write them down. We will take them up, and we will hopefully then have a good exchange after this. We will now start directly with the presentation. So I will give you a short introduction to ESWET, and then we will introduce Anita. On the next slide, you can see that the ESWET members are quite numerous. We increased our membership in the last year. They are all either building turnkey plants or providing components to waste-to-energy plants. And actually, virtually all the plants in Europe have either been built by ESWET members or include their components. So we're really representing the whole sector there. On the next slide, you see basically now the content of my short presentation. The question is, how is municipal solid waste treated, and treated in Europe, but also globally? And this you see on the next slide. The big question there is, how much do we recycle? How much do we recover? And what do we need to put in a landfill, because we cannot do anything? And it's very interesting to see on this statistic, so I will not go to any member state, but if you want, you can search for your own member state. What is very interesting to see is that the green line, the recycling, which is at 48%, is going hand in hand with waste to energy. So the green and the blue line work together. So this shows that the country which is taking the waste treatment, the integrated waste management seriously, is normally looking at the best overall solutions. And this you see that recycling, obviously the best solution for any recyclable waste, but the waste to energy part is then the best solution following the waste hierarchy also for the non-recyclable part of this waste. And obviously first you need to avoid the waste and reuse the waste before you go to recycling, then recovery, and finally landfill. So we see that they go hand in hand, and we see there's a lot of scope still, because a lot of it's still landfilling, or the red bars on the right-hand side are still landfilling a lot. So we need to move them to more recycling, and therefore then also to use the energy and the materials embedded in this residual waste later on with waste to energy. On the next slide, you see that this is not only a European problem, this is a global problem. And we have a report on our webpage where you will see by 2050, we have a projection how we see it evolving by 2050. And we use the numbers of the World Bank that made the report, What a Waste 2.0, they made an update of this. And you see very clearly that by 2050, the projected waste generation by region is increasing enormously. And it is very interesting to see that also in Europe, you see a projection that will increase waste. So it is not by putting the head in the sand that the waste will go away. You need to really work on it and take it in an integrated way. That's the main message I want you to take home. On the next slide, you see that the waste globally is treated very differently. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. We see that last, or 1.5 years ago, in 2019, 70% of all the waste generated worldwide is just dumped, just put in landfills. And we know the biggest landfills, which are also then responsible for having the wind blowing the plastics into the rivers, which then end up in the oceans. So this is already well documented, but we need to do something to get out of this bad circle. And we see in 2050, global waste generation will increase by around 60%. So we really need to be ready to take this into consideration. So the next slide, you have the basics, which you see in Belgium in these different bags. You see that some of the waste is compostable, some is recyclable. Paper is taken even out separately for recycling and can be very well recycled. But you see that other products are not suitable for recycling, and these are in the white bag in Belgium. This is the residual waste. And what happens to this waste? On the next slide, you see that normally, globally mainly, and the red parts of the bars I showed you, there is landfill. And landfill emits methane, obviously, which is 84 times more potent over a 20 years period than CO2. We have the risk of soil and water pollution, and they emit, obviously, also odor. And they normally don't generate any added value. I know that landfill gas is captured, but it is difficult to capture it on an active landfill, which is open. And also it is difficult to capture all of the landfill gas. So there's still a better way up the hierarchy, obviously recovery, recycling, avoidance, and reuse. Next slide basically gives you the added value of not putting it in a landfill, which is recovery of energy, recovery of secondary raw materials, re-injecting it in the economy, so being circular. But these are added values which you should be aware of because we share them quite a lot. And waste to energy is therefore very complementary to recycling. On this picture, you see the waste to energy plant in Denmark, in Copenhagen, where they have made a ski slope on top and they have a climbing wall, and they have really included this in the fabric of the city, which is a very nice, very efficient building also. So, can I please have the next slide? Thank you very much. So this was a short introduction to waste to energy. And now I will hand over to Anita. Anita is Policy Officer in the Commission's Directorate General for Environment since 2014. She has been responsible for the implementation of the Industrial Emissions Directive with focus on large combustion plants and waste incineration. She collaborates with the European Integrated Pollution Prevention and Control Bureau, so the EIPPCB, how it is called, who organizes and coordinates the exchanges of information that finally leads up to the drawing and the review of the best available techniques, so the best available techniques and the reference documents related to those, which is the best available techniques reference documents, the BREFs. Previously, Anita was a senior advisor in the Ministry of Environment in Croatia, and she graduated at the Faculty of Chemical Engineering and Technology in the University of Zagreb. Anita, the floor is all yours, and I will come in after your presentation again. Please.
Good morning to everybody, and thank you, Patrick, very much for the introduction. I have the pleasure to participate in the today's workshop organized by ESWET. Next slide, please. You see the content of my today's presentation. First, I'm going to give you a general overview of the Industrial Emissions Directive and the Waste Incineration Best Available Techniques conclusions. Under the second point, you will be informed on findings of the IED evaluation and the state of play of the ID revision. And I will conclude my presentation with a few key messages. Next slide, please. The Industrial Emissions Directive is the main instrument that regulates emissions of pollutants from large industrial installations in the EU. And the Industrial Emissions Directive is based on an important principle, which is integrated approach. This means that together with emissions, it deals also with other very important environmental aspects, like waste generation and resource efficiency and noise and odor prevention. The Industrial Emissions Directive sets minimum requirements for various industrial sectors, including also waste incineration sector, and this needs to be respected in any circumstances. In addition, the Industrial Emissions Directive requires installations performing activities that are listed in its Annex 1 to operate according to permits based on the use of best available techniques. And to identify best available techniques and best available techniques associated emission levels for various sectors, the information exchange process, so-called CEWEP process, has been established under the Industrial Emissions Directive. And the main objective of this process is to review the best available techniques reference documents, so-called BREFs. Chapter of the BREF that we call Best Available Techniques Conclusions is a legally binding document adopted in a form of a Commission implementing decision. And so far, Commission has adopted 17 best available techniques conclusions under the Industrial Emissions Directive, and 6 additional BREFs are currently under revision. Once the best available techniques conclusions are adopted and published in the official journal of the EU, they apply to new installations following the publication. And for existing installations, the member states' competent authorities have a maximum 4 years to review the permits to make sure that they operate in accordance with the BAT conclusions requirements. However, the Industrial Emissions Directive provides for a possibility for the competent authorities to grant derogations to individual plans from compliance of the best available techniques associated emission levels. But this derogation is subject to strict conditions, and these conditions are also listed in the ID, and this should be assessed on case-by-case basis. However, in case of a derogation, minimum emission limit values in the Industrial Emission Directive remain applicable. Next slide, please. A review of 2006 Waste Incineration BREF started in 2014, and Waste Incineration Best Available Conclusions are published in December 2019. And Waste Incineration BAT conclusions contain best available techniques associated emission levels for air and water emissions, and also best available techniques associated energy efficiency levels. These best available techniques associated emission levels improve the current level of environmental protections for emissions to air for various pollutants like dust, mercury, metals, ammonia, chlorides, dioxins, and furans, PCBs. And the waste incineration BAT conclusions there are differentiated levels in the waste incineration BAT conclusions for new and existing plants. And it is important that improvement also continuous monitoring of mercury and long-term sampling of dioxins and furans. For continuously monitored pollutants, best available techniques associated emission levels are set as a daily averages only. And the waste incineration BAT conclusions also address the recovery of valuable materials from bottom ashes. Next slide, please. In the second part of my presentation, I will cover the IED evaluation and the revision. The recent evaluation of the IED shows that although there are some divergences of opinion, stakeholders have a high degree of satisfaction with the IED and the main implementing acts that are adopted under the IED. And I highlight here the three main lessons learned from the revision process of the IED. The first is that the Industrial Emissions Directive has played an important role in reducing emissions of pollutants from industry, especially to air. The second is that the IED has made a more limited contribution to decarbonisation and circular economy. And the third is that a major IED success is its governance model, so-called Seville process, to collaborate on BREFs. The IED evaluation also concluded that there is a scope to improve and further develop the Industrial Emissions Directive through widening its scope and improving key provisions on permitting and controlling and securing a more transparent and effective access to environmental information and participation in decision making. Next slide, please. We committed under the European Green Deal to review the Industrial Emissions Directive, and we have started work on an impact assessment for both the Industrial Emissions Directive and the European Pollutant Release and Transfer Register, so-called EPRTR. And in this slide, you can see the state of play of both the IED and the EPRTR reviews. So currently we have open public consultations ongoing. So the joint open public consultations for the EPRTR and the IED, and this will stay open until 23rd of March. In parallel, we have published the targeted stakeholder surveys and online, and this is open for the IED until 2nd of April and for EPRTR by end of April. This will be followed by interviews and focus groups, and we will organize the final stakeholder workshop by summer. So we would like you to respond to the open public consultations and to the targeted surveys, and also that you encourage other inputs also from other stakeholders who can contribute. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see useful links regarding the IED and EPRTR reviews. So this is a link to our web page, the Commission web page, and you can find links to the open public consultations and the targeted surveys, but also a link to an online workshop that was held in December to explain stakeholder consultations for the impact assessments for the IED and the EPRTR. Next slide, please. With this slide, I would like to conclude by providing a few messages that are important for the implementation of the waste incineration BAT conclusions. The first one is that BAT conclusions are implementing act adopted by the Commission, and that means legally binding document. Permits have to be updated within 4 years after publication of the BAT conclusions. So it counts from December 2019, and BAT conclusions must be used as a reference for setting permit conditions. Emission limit values in permits must not exceed best available techniques associated emission levels in the waste incineration BAT conclusions. As I said before, derogation is possible, but only in specific and justified cases. And if derogation is granted, then the IED minimum requirements remain applicable. And I would also like to remind that there is no unique rule for compliance with ELVs. that in permits that are based on best available techniques associated emission level ranges in waste incineration BAT conclusions. And once again, I invite you to respond to the open public consultations and to the stakeholders targeted service for both the IED and EPRTR revision. So this was all from my side in this part of the workshop, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you for your presentation. Very clear, very helpful. So if you didn't understand, please reply to the consultation. They are open. You can go follow the links. You will see that the presentations will be available online, so you can download them on the ESWET webpage. With this, Anita, bear with us. We will come back to you after the other presentations and then go to the Q&A. Thank you very much. So let's go to the next presentation. The next presentation will be done by Lighea Speziale. She holds a master's degree in environmental engineering and works since 2012 in CEWEP, the Confederation of European Waste-to-Energy Plants, where she is an external advisor since 1.5 years. Before this, she was part of the secretariat. So she's 1.5 years, she's on her own, having her own consultancy. And she's working therefore as advisor for environment and leads the work on technical dossiers related to emissions to air and water, monitoring techniques, because that's another big issue, life cycle analysis, waste management system, and waste-related law. During the last years, the main focus was the review of the waste incineration BAT reference documents for the BREF, where she coordinated internal work of more than 30 people, produced content and externally followed every aspect of it, from the technical exchange with the Joint Research Center and the EIPPCB, which I presented before, to the preparation of workshops for helping the members on the upcoming implementation. And we had the honor to do this also together with the CEWEP and the ESWET members, where we made common workshops to get this very complicated topic better digestible. And Lighea is also working on other aspects of the Green Deal, such as chemical strategy for sustainability and the zero pollution action plan. Lighea, the floor is all yours, please.
Thank you, Patrick, for the nice introduction, and thank you for having me. And thanks to the participants that have decided to join us today. I will make this presentation from a very unexpectedly sunny day in Brussels. So I hope this reaches you all in your offices or homes, wherever you are listening to us. And I will spend 10 or 15 minutes to tell you something about the operator's perspective after 1 year of the publication, from the publication of the waste incineration BAT conclusions. So first slide, please. So just very briefly, historically, waste-to-energy plants have been regulated at EU level already since 1989 with the first waste incineration directive. And if we fast forward to 2010, the waste-to-energy sector was included in the scope of the so-called Industrial Emissions Directive, which was the result of a merger of several directives, the LCPs and others. Next slide, please. So this brings us to a legal framework that is based on the pillar principle of the IED that was already mentioned by Anita, which is that in order to ensure the prevention and control of pollution, each installation should operate only if it holds a permit. And the permit, as said in Article 14.3, shall be set with BAT conclusions as a reference. So next slide, please. What does that mean? That please click. There is a very nice animation that we can all enjoy. That means that the permit of a waste-to-energy plant specifically will be set starting from the revised waste incineration BAT conclusions, but also that other pieces of legislation have to be taken into account, such as the waste treatment BAT conclusions, the reference report on monitoring, European standards, especially on monitoring, but most importantly, Annex 6 of the IED. Next slide. Why is that? Because IED Annex 6 contains specific provisions for the waste incineration sector that were taken directly from the previous mother law, so the Waste Incineration Directive, including minimum emission limit values, as Anita was saying, and specific compliance rules, for example. These necessary provisions for example, on compliance, are not included in waste incineration BAT conclusions. So how to manage interlinks between Annex 6 and BAT conclusions is still an open question in some cases that is now being tackled during implementation. For example, during normal operating conditions, waste incineration plants have to comply with daily emission limit values that are set on the basis of BAT conclusions. However, specific rules to decide, for example, what constitutes a valid daily average are included in IED Annex 6. So you see how the interactions are on every single aspect of permit writing. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of the main aspects of the document that are important for the operators for this implementation phase, first of all, as a brief mention of the scope. So waste incineration and co-incineration plants whose main purpose is not the production of material products, which means a cement plant's co-incinerating waste will not be in the scope of the waste incineration BAT conclusions, but will be in the scope of the cement and lime BREF, plus other conditions such as that it combusts only waste but not biomass as defined in the IED, and regardless if it is a disposal or recovery operation, if the plants are above the capacity of 3 tons per hour for non-hazardous waste and 10 tons per day for hazardous waste, then they are covered by the BREF and the BAT conclusions. This also counts for biomass treatment for other specific thresholds that are mirroring the thresholds of the IED Annex 1. I would like to briefly mention the fact that there is somehow a discussion open on the techniques and the processes of pyrolysis and gasification, because in the IED, these processes are included as waste incineration if the substances are subsequently incinerated, which normally is interpreted as on-site. However, we would say that even if these substances are incinerated off-site, this still remains the same type of process that should be covered. But in case these processes are mainly for the production of materials, such as secondary raw material, then they are not considered waste incineration, and they are, at the moment, at least to our knowledge, not covered by any BREF. So next slide, please. Implementation is a tricky matter, especially the devil is in the details, and in this case I would say the devil is in the simple aspects. So already when you discuss some definitions, there is room for negotiation, let's say, and interpretation. In fact, it seemed necessary during the discussion in the TWG and in Seville to define the fact that a bottom ash treatment plant does not include the salt separation of coarse metals at the incineration plant. So this is not considered as a specific treatment to bottom ash. And what is now more important is what is considered a major plant upgrade and a new plant. Because, okay, if a new plant is permitted following the publication, this is quite clear. However, it is also included a complete replacement of a plant following the publication of these BAT conclusions. And what is a complete replacement can be up for discussion in some cases. So it would be, it would help a level playing field between different operators that something like a change in the water steam cycle is not considered like a complete change in the plant, and therefore trigger a different status for the installation. Next slide, please. Main new requirements, already Anita mentioned some of them. Anyway, just allow me to list a few of them. The first one is continuous sampling of dioxins and dioxins like PCBs once every month, with the exception for dioxins and dioxins like PCBs if the emission levels are proven to be sufficiently stable. What does that mean? Again, as I said, implementation is all in the details. So what we see from the discussions that the operators are having with the competent authorities is that proven to be sufficiently stable might mean something like 6 or 7 measurements in a row that are more or less of the same value and well below the limit. In that case, it can be considered that you proved the condition. And in that case, then you're asked to do periodic measurements at least every 6 months. Then continuous mercury monitoring, which was the big new thing for this BREF. Exemption if waste with a proven low and stable mercury content, which is different. One thing is proving emission and one thing is proving waste input. if this exemption is somehow proven, then continuous measurement can be replaced by either long-term sampling or periodic measurements. Then continuous monitoring of ammonia and new ranges for NOx especially. So for new plants, it goes from 50 to 120 milligram per normal cubic meter, can go from 50 to 150 or 180 if SCR is not applicable for existing plants. And may I remind that there is no difference anymore, no different status anymore for small plants as it is in the IED. If you are with a capacity lower than 6 tons per hour, then it was a different set of rules. Next slide, please. Some examples of implementation issues that we're facing that did not really came as a surprise, because we have already mentioned this during the BREF review. The first one is that BATALs refer to normal operating conditions, and therefore emission limit values set in permits from BATALs apply in normal operating conditions. And this is a specific aspect that I will also touch upon in the next slide. How to take into account measurement uncertainty when using BATAL to set ELVs is a very complex topic that touches most of the pollutants that are continuously monitored. We can refer to this text that was written in the end at the final meeting in chapter 7 of the Waste Incineration BREF, which says that the TWG, that is the expert group that works in Seville on the BREF review, highlighted the potential difficulty to assess compliance with emission limit values when these are set around the lower end of BATAL ranges, because the lower the concentration, the higher the uncertainty in relative value. And then how to calculate valid daily average in normal operating conditions, because as I mentioned, the calculation rules are given in Annex 6, and Annex 6 does not refer to normal operating conditions, but to something called effective operating time. That is a larger period of time, and it comes from the Waste Incineration Directive originally. How to address the indicative half-hourly values for mercury, because they don't have the status of BATALs, but they are in the BAT conclusions. And in general, how to assess compliance with BATs and BATALs. Next slide. So the first bullet point from the last slide, what is the issue between effective operating time and normal operating conditions? I could take 1 hour, maybe 2, just to talk about this topic, but let's say as an overview that the IED, as I mentioned, has a special regime in Annex 6 for waste incineration, and where it is mentioned that compliance in effective operating time is the reference for continuous measurements, while other sectors in the IED comply in normal operating conditions. However, in the general chapters of the IED, reference for BATALs is in normal operating conditions. So you see that here there is an open discussion that we tried to address during BREF review, but it was not doable, because also what the so-called other than normal operating conditions are sometimes very site specific. So operating conditions such as normal or EOT, which BATALs refer to, are not clarified in the BAT conclusions, although in background documents and discussions in BREF reviews, it was specified that they were derived in normal operating conditions. So next slide, please. Other big topic, measurement uncertainty, is an issue linked to the nature of legally binding BATALs. And what I would like to say is that for the moment, the only legal reference that we have is Annex 6 of the IED and the relative EN standards that are mentioned and quoted and referenced in the waste incineration BAT conclusion. So this should be the one that are used by competent authorities in order to allow for legal certainty of compliance and a level playing field around Europe. So next slide, please. So I think there was one slide before that we skipped. Yes. So where are we? But conclusions were published in December 2019. There is a time frame of 4 years. At the end of this time, all permits conditions are reconsidered and, if necessary, updated, and the installation complies with those permit conditions. In the IED, there are a number of articles that give the permit authorities the elements for the application and obligations of the operators and measures to be included. These measures are mainly coming from waste incineration bad conclusions, but not only, as I mentioned already, Annex 6, the standards and other pieces of legislation need to be taken into account. What's important is that some member states can adopt the so-called general binding rules, and in such case, the permit may simply include a reference to such rules. So next slide. So, of course, the implementation process is slow because of the pandemic. So until now, we don't really have a lot of permit applications already under review in practice. In some cases, member states and competent authorities are still reflecting. However, countries that have applied general binding rules have recently published or are going to publish very soon the national guidelines. And we have some examples. For example, in France, they published a decree where they stated that ELVs that are set from battles will only apply normal operating conditions. And this means that for daily averages, they will have 2 sets of ELVs for each pollutant. One will be the one taken from the bad conclusions that will only refer to normal operating conditions, and then for other normal operating conditions included in effective operating time, you will have to comply with the limits in Annex 6. In general, we saw that the whole range of battles was assessed by national authorities when setting ELVs in national guidelines, and that for some topics, such as what are other than normal operating conditions, flexibility was allowed to local authorities, as this is a site-specific issue. So next slide, please. I will try to bring you on a tour to Europe, although we cannot do this right now, and we're all quite sad, but just we try to do it virtually as much as we can. And I give you a small overview of how the member states are approaching the implementation in some cases, like in Sweden, in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, in Denmark. The implementation is local, so each plant discusses with its competent authority, might be regional, might be even on a province level, depending on the place. And in other countries, such as Germany and France, they translated the bad conclusions into law. And in other places like Flanders and Ireland, they went into one-to-one translation. And in some places, they're trying to do local implementation with a national coordination, such as Norway or Portugal, where they try to at least give some directions that is the same for all. So I think this is the last slide, maybe. Yes. So thanks a lot for listening to this. If you have any questions, please write them down and we can discuss them later. Thank you.
Lighea, so you understood it's not so easy to implement the BREF, to jungle between the BREF, the Annex 6 requirements, and then maybe some local permitting specificities. So you really have to dig into this. And we will now hear from the next speaker, Bettina, about how this is done on European level. So thanks a lot, Lighea, and let's go over to Bettina. So Bettina has a background in chemical engineering and more than 25 years of experience. So she's a very experienced person on these topics because she has been responsible for several waste strategy facilities in Europe already, in North America, in Asia, in the Middle East, and she has acquired quite some portfolio, the impressive portfolio of waste strategy projects. So she really speaks out of her global experience. She's an expert in innovative waste energy solutions, as well as technology assessments and environmental approvals. So not only is she working for Ramboll on these topics, but she has also been chair of the International Solid Waste Association, ISWA, the scientific and technical committee, and chairs of ISWA's working group on energy recovery. And she has been a board member of ISWA also. So she is active globally in the International Solid Waste Association, but also on specific projects globally, as mentioned before. So we're very curious to listen to your presentation, Bettina, and then afterwards will be the panel discussion with all three where we'll take these questions. Please, Bettina, the floor is all yours.
Yep, thank you very much for the introduction. If you can go to the next slide, please. I was very happy that, Patrick, in the beginning that you showed the plant in Copenhagen, not only because it's my hometown and I can actually look at the plant every day out of my office window, not right now where we are working from home due to COVID-19, but normally I can see the plant. So it's a nice view. And Ramboll was a technical consultant to that, so that's of course also very nice that you showed the plant. But also because this first slide here is a good example of how the permit was actually given in Copenhagen. So the red dotted line, that is the level that are in the IED. And then you can see the gray columns that indicate that the actual permit requested lower limits than what was allowed according to the IED. And then actually the green levels, that was what was expected and guaranteed from the technology provider. So that is typically what we see in many facilities in Europe, that we have these three, you can say, levels of approval. So let us go to the next slide. And my slide would definitely not be very technical. It will give a high-level introduction to what emission limit values we see in different parts of the world. And I encourage you to ask questions afterwards. So, but this will give you a first-hand impression of what we see worldwide. And I'm starting with North America. That means Canada and US. And in US, there have not been many new waste-to-energy plants built over the last, say, 10 years or so. The one you will see on the picture, that is the newest, that was in Florida, West Palm Beach. We participated as technical advisors, so we have some insight from that plant. But generally, you can say in US on the federal level, there are some emission limit values that has to be, you can say, as a minimum requirement to all waste-to-energy plants. But it functions so that the permits are actually given by the individual states, and they are free then to come up with more strict ELVs, and they normally do when they are looking into new projects. They have a system more or less as we have in Europe for the BAT or the BREF node, but they call it MACT, so Maximum Achievable Control Technology. And that was also what dictated the emission limit values for the new plant you see here in Florida. And it was actually specifically MACT that requested a catalyst system for the new plant, which was not the norm, so to say, in US, but due to the fact that this was a new plant and there were technology references to other existing plants that are using the catalyst system, then it was decided to give it as a precaution in the permit that should be done. It actually resulted in a re-tendering, but it is up running now and are following the rules. The emission limit values that are requested for the new line here is more or less similar to the IED in Europe. But for the existing facilities in US, it's quite a different situation, and many of them are operated based on older permits, and some of the components are not measured continuously as we see in Europe. But for new plant, it would be more or less the same as we see in the European directives. For Canada, it's something similar. We do not see many new waste-to-energy being built over the last 10 years. The projects that have been upcoming and being discussed are very much leaning on the European emission limit values. Each province in Canada has its own regulation, but most of them, and especially in the Ontario region and in British Columbia, are very similar to what we see in Europe. There is a new one in Durham, York, in Ontario, and the limit values there are very, very close to the European emission limit values. And when the permit was given, I think it must be around 10 years back, they were looking very much towards Europe and compared their existing emission limit values with what we have in Europe. So let us move to the next slide. It is Southeast Asia or Asia, and I have decided to present Singapore as a special case because Singapore have had waste to energy for very long time, and they have of course been used to set permits for waste to energy plants. In Singapore, it is so that there is a general industrial regulation, so there is no specific regulation for waste to energy as such. And it also means that the regulatory requirement generally is a bit higher than what we see in Europe, because it's a level playing field, you can say, for other industries, and it is a certain higher level than we see in Europe. But with that said, the new waste to energy plants in Singapore are actually designed for future proof, you can say, and they have been requested to follow more or less the European emission limit values when it comes to the guarantees that the technology providers have to give for the plant. So even though it's not a regulatory requirement, the authority have decided to look towards Europe because they expect that it may come over the lifetime of the plant. If we take rest of Southeast Asia or Asia, it depends a little from country to country if they have specific regulations or emission limit values for waste to energy facilities, or if it's a more general industrial limit that they are working accordingly. But I would say very often the projects where we have been involved seems to follow more or less the European limits. But we can also see that the countries are maybe not so mature in discussing the waste to energy technology, and we have seen that sometimes there is no differentiation between daily or half-hourly values, and we have even seen some draft permits where there were no reference to an average period. So there were some authorities that believed that they could go to the plant and measure immediately, and then they have to be below the European limit value. So there are some discussion that definitely has not been taken in these countries. But still, we see a tendency to follow the European levels, either because the developers want so due to their, you can say, their reputation. It could also, what we often see, that the technology providers actually come in with the prospect and say that we can fulfill the European levels. Or of course, it could also be that the local authorities actually put it into the permit. And also something to remember is that we also have the lenders, and we have seen in some cases that the lenders actually came back and requested limit values corresponding to the European levels, even though it was not demanded by the authority permits. So let us move to the next one. Australia. If we go back some few years, there were not much discussion about waste to energy in Australia. That have changed significantly over the last years, also due to the restrictions to import waste to China, and a wish for the Australian authorities to treat the waste closer to home, so to say. And also we see levels on landfill, so landfill maybe not bans, but at least the levies on high to in some provinces, high levies on landfill, so that have encouraged people to go more towards waste to energy. The local province is the one that set the emission limit values, and we see that it differs from one state to another. But generally, I would say that many of them are looking very closely to the European emission limit values. And we have been in discussion with authorities where they have more or less copied the European experience and put that in place. Generally, we can say that the plants under construction, the picture you see here is from Perth in Western Australia, and the plant is following the European directive from or Industrial Emission Directive from 2010. And we are involved in new projects in the eastern part of Australia, And there they are actually looking directly at BREF, referring to the BREF 2019. So in one way or another, that will be incorporated into the permit for the new plant, at least in that state. So let us move to the next slide. Middle East. Most countries there, they have implemented specific waste to energy regulatory requirements or are in the process of doing so. But often we see that the requirements are very similar to the European 2010 directive. There is a little difference if the country is focusing on daily average only, or if they also include the half hourly and in some cases hourly values. Some are actually going below the European emission limit values. In most cases, that has either been, you can say, caused by the developers or by the lenders that are setting up these requirements due to reputation. And then the last slide is from Africa. There are few waste to energy plants built. The one you see here, that is in Addis Ababa, and it's following the EU directive. It should not have been 2020, it should have been 2010. But the projects that we are involved in that are maybe under feasibility or conceptual stage, we see that the local governments, they are very much looking into the European directive as a benchmark. So they don't want to implement something that are, you can say, not fulfilling the same emission limit values as we are using in Europe, at least the 2010 directive. Sometimes we also see that the developers, they are voluntarily going in and offering EU standards, but we often also sometimes see that they just briefly say that it's according to the European standards without actually defining exactly what they means. And the discussion that we just heard from Lighea about NOC and ADNOC and measuring uncertainties and so on, we honestly do not see that in any of the regions that we have just seen here. So that was just a very high level introduction to what we see globally. And if I should sum up, I could say that definitely the European experience has been taken into consideration in most part of the world where waste to energy facilities are being discussed. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bettina, and thanks for this overview. Can I now ask the other panelists to show the cameras or put their cameras on again? Thank you very much. So we have received some questions and also have some questions. Maybe we'll stay with you, Bettina, with the last example you had just shown about the plant in Africa. If you look at the European standards and what is required and requested, you see that there's a certain cost to all these implementation and the measures and the very low values sometimes. On the other side, you see if you would not implement at all a waste to energy plant, then even one with less strict values, then the waste to energy would end up, or sorry, the residual waste would end up on landfills, which having a bigger environmental impact. Do you think that following European standard could set off or make it too expensive for some countries around the globe to implement waste to energy? Would you then say this should be a stepwise approach like it was done in Europe? We started with the higher values and the more we evolved, the lower the values got? Or what is the situation globally and how can we take this cost issue into consideration when you look at this?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and of course not an easy question to give one answer to. But I think you're right that we have to take into consideration that in many countries, waste to energy are, you can say, the alternative to waste to energy would be landfill. And in many cases, we do not have the same regulatory framework as we have in Europe, where we have a political push towards recycling and energy recovery. In many countries, it's free for the municipal solid waste and industrial waste to go to landfill. And in many cases, it will be to a cheap cost, also because it's maybe not sanitary landfill, but lower quality of landfill. So you are absolutely right. It has to be taken into consideration what these countries can afford. At the same time, of course, they want to benchmark with other countries, and they want not to be in a position where someone can say that we introduce a lower quality than what we see in other countries. But I agree with you that it should be a balance, and I think it would be difficult to go from a country where we have 100% landfill or maybe even dumping to a very sophisticated high-level waste-to-energy plant. Both because you can say the whole system have to mature to that, but also because it has a cost. So if I should say that there could be some of the specific, you can say, specialities in the European directive that we could maybe implement stage-wise, and then we could maybe look at the daily average and say that could maybe be followed, but the half-hourly could maybe be considered because that is what drives the cost if it has to fulfill in all half-hourly values. And also maybe you can say there could be other specific components that we could consider and compare what other industries do we see in the region. Of course, NOx is something that could be considered and compared with other industries. And maybe Singapore is a good example, because I think we all know that Singapore is a clean country and have a lot of restriction on many things, but they want to have a level playing field, and therefore they do not have a specific regulation for waste to energy, but considered as an industry as such.
Okay, thank you very much, Bettina. We have received more questions. One question was specifically also for Lighea. The question was, and there came two different people who asked this, one member state, but also some industry, is about which AELs to follow if you mix waste with biomass. How is this complex for permitting of a waste and biomass plant? Do you have then still to follow the AELs or not, or what could you advise?
Well, this is the, let's say, a critical point. We know that biomass and biomass plants were even in the discussion for the final decision on the BOT conclusions, meaning that there is a small part of plants that are not covered in the BREF and are not covered in the waste incineration BREF. But I would say the principle is what counts. So we're talking about best available techniques. So you have to look at the plant, the configuration of the plant. If this plant is built in a way that is more similar to the techniques applied for waste incineration, then this is where you will look at. Otherwise, you will look at the LCP BREF. And if the plant is really small, then you go into the medium combustion plants directive. But I would say that at least this was not true with the cement and lime BREF, but if you go into the LCP BOT conclusions, then you will see there is a specific BAT that says that regardless of whatever is written there, if you co-incinerate waste, then you have to also look into the waste incineration BREF to make sure that you are applying the same environmental protection. So there's no straightforward answer that counts for everybody. You have to look at the installation that you are assessing, but I would say that you do it with this in mind. The point is best available techniques. So you look at the installation and you see if in your expert judgment, it falls more into an LCP or a waste incineration.
So basically, if there is the possibility or the idea or the permit should cover also waste co-incineration, it has to follow the waste incineration BREF and the requirements related to those. One could say this. Thank you very much. Anita, there was a question for you also. We're now discussing the review of the IED, and in there are a lot of sectors covered, obviously. Is in the review of the IED also the discussion to look at landfills and to look more at the emissions and the impact of landfills related with the IED? This is something which is tackled in the review process.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, as I said in my presentation, we are now in the process, we started the revision process of the Industrial Emissions Directive. And now we are looking in different options. And the main objective of this revision process is to contribute the best to zero pollution action plan, to decarbonization, to circular economy, but also to address findings from the ID evaluation. So in that context, we will be also looking to different options on how to extend the scope of the IED. But so, as I said, there are different options included in the revision process that are also now. If you look to the targeted stakeholder service, you can find specific questions. But in this moment, we have no position. So in this moment, we are looking to the options. So one of option is also related to how to regulate landfills that are now covered with the landfill directive, but not yet with the IED in context of applicable best available techniques. But in fact, landfills are covered with the IED, with Chapter 2, so they have to operate in accordance to the permit, and all other provisions of Chapter 2 apply for permitting, but best available techniques are described in the landfill directive.
Okay. Thank you very much. We had a question. Some people wondered why in the US there's very little waste to energy. Who can reply to this one?
I wish I could give you a good answer. I don't know. I don't understand it either. There should be plenty of room for waste to energy. A lot of waste is going to landfill. And I think that we miss the regulatory framework where we have a waste hierarchy and looking at it in the same way as we do in Europe and in many other jurisdictions. Maybe the attention to circular economy will help a bit, that there will be a little more focus on that waste is a resource and not just a waste. So hopefully it will change. Over the last, I would say, short while actually, 1 or 2 years, I think I've seen a little more interest in discussing alternative to landfill. So I can only hope that it will come. But combustion, incineration have had a bad reputation in US up to now. And I have worked at least 15 years in US on projects there and tried to convince that waste to energy is a well-proven technology and it's good for the environment and better than the landfill. But it's a tough job to convince people that it's the right way to do it. There are 85 waste to energy facilities today, and of course, looking at the size of the country, there should be much more. And hopefully, the West Palm Beach facility could be something for the other states to look at, and I really hope that over time there will be more.
Maybe one of the other reasons is that they are less densely populated than Europe, and therefore there's a lot of space for landfills, which are not touching or not disturbing anyone. So it's also easier to get rid of your waste in a way which is not seen.
That's of course also part of it, because you can say in the states where we see waste to energy facilities, it is mainly in the states where they do not have direct access to a lot of land. So yes, definitely that might also be a part of it.
Thank you.
Actually also see now that there is an interest to expand the use of energy for district heating or industrial purposes. So that may also help if they can see there's a purpose there. But of course, the shale gas has also, over the last 10 years, put low prices for the energy consumption in US, and that has of course not been beneficial for waste to energy facilities.
I have another question for the three of you. Bettina showed a slide which was very clear. She showed about what is the associated emission levels. She showed what is in the permit, which is lower, and she showed the effective emissions, which were even lower. So imagine 100 would be AEL, 50 would be the permit, and the emissions themselves would be 25. Why would you not put the AEL at 25 then, if anyhow the emission is only 25? Why do you do the permit or the AEL at 100? What's the added value of doing this?
I can try to give an answer. Then hopefully Lighea and Anita will supplement. I think it's important to consider also the daily operation of the plant. I mean, it's a mix of various waste coming in, and as an operator, you really need to be able to cope with the daily operation. And if the permit is too low, you of course have the risk that you will have cases where you will exceed the permit and also the ELV. So I think it's important to have a margin to allow for whatever may happen during the operation. And all in the industry knows that the bunker is a very important part. Many tend to believe that it's all the complicated and complex installation, but it's also very much rely on what you have in the bunker and how well you mix the waste in the bunker. So there will be peaks, no doubt about that, because waste is a mix of everything, and that should be able to cope with. So my answer was more from a practical perspective. So maybe Anita or Lighea have another.
I would agree. I think, first of all, there is a reason why you don't have only one type of time average, meaning you have half-hourly averages that you have to check, you have daily averages. And we know that depending on the plant, not on European level, but in many permits, you have longer averages. You can have a yearly average, or you can have a mass load limit. So I would say that it depends what your limit is aiming at. So the half-hourly limit is, in a way, assessing the good operation of the plant. And that means that if you incinerate waste, and waste is by definition heterogeneous, you need room to operate. The half-hourly value has to take into account the fluctuations that are normal and that the operator needs to deal with every day. In the daily average, you already see that the fluctuations have less of an impact and the limits are lower. And so for me, it's a mix of instruments. The point is not only to have the lowest limit possible, but to allow for the best environmental protection as a whole. Because otherwise we can say, well, we're not putting the lower limit for all, because it just wouldn't work. There is no plant that you have to take into account the cross-media effects, but also you have to take into account the fact that to lower the limits until a certain value, you need to use more reagents, and these reagents are produced somewhere. So by concentrating just on the fact that the limit has to be as low as possible, you might lose track on other aspects that will in the end have an environmental impact that you're not accounting for.
Okay. So I don't know, you want to add something, Anita? Or
yes, thank you.
The limit is very low.
Yes, thank you. I would like to emphasize that we have two sets of levels. So we have the IED and we have bad conclusions. And the levels in the IED are fixed at one level. So it's a specific level, while but associated emission level are given in a range of emissions. And the competent authorities, when setting permit conditions, they have to choose a level within the range. So not necessarily the upper end of the range, and that can vary on case by case. So that can be also reason why we can find And we expect that we find different levels in the permit, not that the competent authorities just set the upper end of the BAT range in the permit. That is in fact principle of the permitting process. And of course, I agree with what Bettina said, that this is a specific sector with lots of variations in its operations, and depends on content, on pollution that you find in waste. So it means that in practice you can expect lower levels, but also some also moments where it will be like you will have peaks, etc. Right? But then in that is why we have assessment of compliance rules, that they also tolerate certain amount of peaks, and that is also reason why we have also provisions of other than normal operating conditions, etc. Right? So it's a really specific sector. So yeah.
So basically, the reply is that the waste composition is unknown in details. You know roughly what it is, but the details can vary. Therefore, there can be some peaks, that it was said, and you need to reflect this operational reality in the permits and in the values, and that's why you have these different levels and not only the lowest level in the permit. Good, thank you very much. We have a question linked to this. Some plants which are built now are very, very low. The requirements are very low. So the permits foresee, let's say, 1 milligram of dust per norm cubic meter or something like this, very low values. And but there are problems with approving this. The analyzers are not always able to show this. There have been a report in 2016 with the nearest, which we co-sponsored between CEWEP and also ESWET and others. And the question is therefore, are there new documents to analysis to explain how we can prove and we can measure these values, because the until now known equipment is not really capable of doing so, and the procedures to prove this is not really clear on how to prove these very low values. So how to deal with this?
Maybe I can start with this, and then the others can complement. So indeed, this is a topic that has become more and more important, especially for the waste incineration sector, because public pressure has always been very high, and the sector itself has proven very, very low emissions over the years. So somehow the analyzer have been pushed to their limits of performances, and we see this even more, and it's even quite clear in the BATEL ranges, because often the lower end is associated with the less than symbol that is used if you look into the BREF guidance, because you don't really know if you are actually able to comply with this limit within the reasonable uncertainty values. So what I would say is that this question is still open. The problem is that finding an actual uncertainty associated to measured values when they are so low is not something that is easily done and systematically done, because uncertainties have many aspects of repeatability and reproducibility. So the theoretical approach, which is that you have to find the actual uncertainty associated to the value, is more easily said than done. And for the moment, the only reference that we have is the values that are linked to Annex 6 in the IED. These are the maximum values that are associated with the ELVs. And in order to avoid that every plant goes in a different way and every competent authority goes in a different way, and that therefore level playing field is not really guaranteed, we would suggest to follow what is in Annex 6 and complement it with the standards, because now we have EN 14181, but we also have the standard on data handling and acquisition system, which helps to really make sure that you are doing the best you can with your monitoring equipment. But it is indeed a topic that will need further investigation, and I hope that from experts in the field, such as STAN, but also national standards, we will get some more information on how to account for uncertainty in the correct way.
If I should add a comment, yeah, if I would like to add a comment to that and look a little bit outside Europe, which was the topic of my presentation, and say the discussion about this problem is almost non-existing. So I think it's important that we all involved in the sector are starting to talk more about it also outside Europe, so that we do not risk that the lower level are just copied without thinking about the implication that it may have. And I think many countries, they have not seen the problem, they have not realized the problem, because they are operating at higher levels today, and they do not see the problem. And some of the authorities, even though they are involved in permitting and all that, they have not experienced that, and therefore they may not take it sufficiently into consideration when they give permits, that it is a challenge that need to be looked more into. So I think it's about communication and how we bring it to the market that we have an issue here. Of course, the European countries, they should hopefully know, because it has been discussed a lot over the last years when we have revised the new BREF, but outside Europe it is almost non-existing.
Thank you. Okay, I have a lot of questions coming. I'm not sure we'll be able to deal all of them, but let's have a question maybe also aimed at the Commission. There's one question: is the IAD the right tool to address the decarbonisation and the circular economy? Is this where it should go? Should it be the IAD?
It's a question for me, yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, I already mentioned. So one of our objectives during the IAD revision process will be also to find options on how to contribute more to circular economy aspects and to decarbonization. Because, as I said in my presentation, the IED applies an integrated approach, and it covers also other environmental aspects than emissions. So this is also resource efficiency, but also, and in that respect, the IED evaluation shows that the directive had a limited contribution to that aspects. So now, during the impact assessment and the revision process, we are going to look in options on how to better address these aspects. In terms of decarbonization, we know that the main current EU policy is the ETS that regulates CO2 emissions. And installations that are covered with the ETS, they are exempt from setting CO2 emissions in IED permits, and also energy efficiency levels. But the BAT conclusions, to some extent, in general, address these aspects through the best available techniques on energy efficiency, but also through the energy efficiency levels. But in principle, BREF revision process somehow omitted to look into more details in the decarbonization techniques and CO2 emissions in general, in respective if the plans were in the ETS or not. But in the future, it will be more and more investments in decarbonization techniques and reduction of CO2 emissions. And we know that these technologies can have also impact to emissions of other pollutants, not only to CO2. And then we have to look in the synergies and how it can impact also other pollutants. And that is why we are looking in options how to best address decarbonization technologies in the future, also through the IED and BREF revision process.
Thank you. This gives me a next question, because we made a webinar recently in ESWET where we had a clear statement that more than half of the CO2 emitted from waste to energy plant is biogenic CO2. So it's CO2 coming from plants, and therefore, for the moment at least, it is not considered in the ETS, and you don't need to buy credits for this biomass CO2 which is emitted. If you want to reduce the CO2 emissions from a waste to energy plants, what would be the options? And the next question to this, coming back to what we said before, how would this impact the price of the waste treatment? Would this not therefore create an incentive to not treat the residual waste properly, or what? How is it? Or is there no impact because the price will not improve? Can anybody talk about what are the options to decarbonize emissions from a waste to energy plant, and any guess on what the potential added value or risk could be if doing so?
I could comment on that and development that we see in more countries. I mean, a few years ago, we didn't talk very much about carbon capture. We thought that that technology was extremely expensive to put on a waste to energy facility. Today, we see more and more that countries are talking about it as a realistic solution. And I can take Denmark, where I come from, as an example. Many plants in Denmark are looking at that opportunity right now. And it should be seen in relation to a CO2 tax that is being discussed in Denmark, if or not it should be implemented, and what should it then be if it should be implemented. And there are a lot of talk of implementing a CO2 tax as around 1,500 Danish kroner, so that is 200 euro more or less. And if that is the place, if that will come in place, then definitely the carbon capture can compete with paying the tax. So that is one of the solutions that can be done to reduce the CO2 emission, or we can decarbonize the facilities. Of course, then also you can say sending plastic to somewhere else is also being discussed, but of course it also have the technical challenges that many politicians believe that plastic can be recycled, and that's just a simple process, but it is not. There are a lot of plastic that cannot be mechanically recycled due to technical difficulties, and plastic is not just plastic, and that is maybe not clear for everyone talking in the political arenas. So I would say a combination of various opportunities is most likely the case looking forward, but at least in some of the mature waste to energy countries, I would guess that CO2 capture could be a solution, especially if a CO2 tax is coming online as well.
Yes, if I may add, I say that one has to look at the issue of waste treatment in general. So waste is the input to treatment plants, whether it is waste incineration, whether it is a landfill, whether it is anaerobic digestion, and then decide on the whole value chain, on the whole chain of waste treatment, which are the best approaches to take to reduce the carbon impact of the sector. That means that, as Bettina was saying, if you are in a place where there is no landfill anymore, and the plants, for example, have already maximized their energy efficiency, they have already maximized their metal recovery, which are the two main aspects from which you can gain carbon advantages, then you will go further. You can do carbon capture, you can do hydrogen. However, in Europe, there are still many places where landfills are a big reality, and I would say that in that case, you need to first deal with the low-hanging fruits and then to the rest. So as usual, we should remember that waste treatment is not at all homogeneous in Europe, and that means that there is no one solution that will be the best everywhere. And one has to be given the whole set of options, and then the best one for that specific case will apply, I would say.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we have a lot of questions, which is a group of questions. We have 5 minutes left, so maybe you can take them down. I will ask you 3-4 sub-questions for the same. It's a bit more than a year now that it has been published. How far has the ELs, the BREF conclusions, be implemented by the operators. If they have been implemented, yes, this had an impact on the monitoring equipment. If it had been implemented, would there then higher or the lower levels in the permits be implemented? What can we see on this? And if we have implemented them, have there a lot of derogation been asked? If yes, on why, on which ground have they been asked? And these are, let's say, let's start with this sort of questions. So has it been done? Has it an impact on the measurement equipment? Which kind, upper or lower limits? And have derogation be asked and why? Please, shoot.
Okay, fast. So it's been implemented at a very different speed, as I showed in my slide. It depends if countries have done the national guidelines or not. So in case they have done it, then in most countries there are published national guidelines. In places where implementation is local, it depends on a case by case. Definitely if we exclude Germany, for 90% of the European plants, the big news is monitoring of mercury continuously. And that definitely impacts the monitoring equipment because you need specific instruments to do that. Not only mercury is an extremely volatile and difficult pollutant to monitor, and it behaves in a very strange way. So monitoring equipment are indeed challenged, and mercury is a perfect example for this measurement uncertainty issue. Higher or lower ends depends. So as Anita was saying, you have to look at the whole range, and this is what has been done. So in some countries they have applied. So let's first of all not look at each pollutant separately. You have to look at the whole set together because there are cross-media effects. So systematic approach on upper or lower end without looking into specifics doesn't make any sense. And this is been shown. For example, in France, they have lower limits for NOx. In Germany, they have lower limits for mercury. In Italy, they have lower limits for many pollutants. So it depends. Sometimes upper end, sometimes lower end, sometimes in the middle. As Anita was saying, there's no rule on the European level. And derogation, to my knowledge, waste energy plants don't ask for derogations because anyway, they have been used to very strict rules for a long time. They are under political pressure. Most of the time, they really try their best to comply and even go beyond the requirements that they are set in the EU law.
Thanks, Liga. I don't know, Anita or Bettina?
I see very much the same picture as Lighea, actually. So I don't think I have so much to add. Maybe okay. If I look at it from the operator side, I feel some are hesitant and say, let us see what comes.
Okay. We have a last question because then we need to conclude. The last question I would have is, we have seen in January 21, the European Court of Justice annulling the emission limits. It was in the frame of the large combustion plant BREF. There's 12 months now for the revision of this ruling. Are you aware of this ruling? Can you comment on this? What will be the impact, or is it something you're not able to comment at this stage? No one?
I don't want to comment, but I just would like to say that LCP BAT conclusions remain applicable, and the operators have to comply within the deadline that is still valid. So yeah.
So there's no impact on this implementation. Yeah. And maybe with this, we have to close. It's now 11:29. If you want to have a last word or a last comment, it's the moment.
Well, we'll meet in a year from now.
Let's meet in a year from now. So there were other questions about effective operating time and normal operating and so on, but this goes very much into the details. Drop us an email, it's very easy, or go to Bettina, she's a consultant, she can help you. Lighea, she's a consultant, she can help you. They're both very knowledgeable. One is a bit bigger company, one a bit smaller company, but they are all very knowledgeable and very active in this topic. And so you can drop them an email. All the slides will be online. It will be shown on our YouTube channel, and you can also go on our webpage to stream this afterwards. And with this, I want to thank all intervenants. Thank you very much. I was very happy to have a panel where I was the own male representative. So thank you very, very much for your time, for your dedication, And I'm looking forward for 1 year later, see how it evolved and if it was implemented a bit more in the meantime. Thank you very much. Thanks for the people who followed us, for all these questions. You have the contact details, and have a nice weekend. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for your time. Bye.